welcome to Rethinking Capitalism. We actually, in this conversation, we want to have two voices on this topic that you may not have necessarily heard before. And it's part of our approach to really try to bring diverse discourses together, to think together about how we can do this differently. So we have Professor Shruti Pandey, who had a discussion with us, who had a fireside chat earlier this morning, and who really has some, I would say, some important discourses around human rights approach to rethinking capitalism, not necessarily in a broad way, but certainly in the context of urbanization and the movements that we are seeing, capital and technology, and how it's driving in society. And we have Dr. Keston Perry, who is a fellow Trinidad and Tobago citizen. And I guess you all could see I've brought a lot of people from Trinidad and Tobago, thinkers that I deeply respect, who has some innovative thinking around decoloniality and climate justice and those perspectives, and how do we rethink industrialization from an evolving economy perspective. And so really excited to welcome both Dr. Keston Perry and Professor Shruti Pandey to this discussion today. Hi, guys. Okay, Keston. Keston, hi. We have, sorry? You're on mute.
Okay. Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm okay, I'm okay. And I was thinking we could kick off the discussion with you sharing a little bit about your ideas around decoloniality and the climate justice agenda. We had a spot for you on the agenda, and there was a little timing issue. So I think it would be wonderful if you could share some of those thoughts at the top of this discussion, and then we would go further.
Yeah, I think thanks, Margaret. I think we're at a very interesting moment where there are a number of forces convulsing that are causing us to consider the issues, a number of issues that the world is facing. But I think also that countries in the global south are particularly engrossed in, or which have been engrossed in addressing for decades, right? The issue of climate change. The lexicon have moved on to discussing the climate crisis and climate breakdown, and those particular terms require us to think in the those terms consider us to think about the fact that we are in this particular pandemic, but the issues around climate change seem slow moving. The effects of climate change seem very, that they are years or decades beyond now. And so many people have somewhat put climate change or issues around the climate crisis on the back burner. But I think I want to highlight many countries in the Caribbean region, as well as in Africa and South Pacific and South Asian countries, have been at the forefront and are facing the brunt of the huge economic costs, but also the huge effects on livelihoods, on their geographical and topographical makeup and composition. And these are issues that we need to think about as current. The climate crisis is current. I mean, if we think about what's going on in the Atlantic hurricane season at the moment, where we've had more than a dozen hurricanes or tropical storms that have already, for this year alone, have been formed and have been affecting a number of regions, both in the Pacific and elsewhere. We also, I think we need to think about linking the processes of colonialism and the processes of industrialization that have happened in, I guess, Western Europe and the United States to what is going on to today. And countries in Western Europe and the United States have been, if we consider the cumulative effect these countries have had in terms of generating greenhouse gas emissions, the United States and Europe alone have generated about 47% of greenhouse gases, cumulatively, in terms of our history of looking at the issue around, and the records show us. So it is linked, the issues around how countries have been subjugated during the period of colonialism, which lasted 500 years or so, and the specific types of infrastructure they've built, the specific types of agricultural practices that they've engaged in, and how their economies have been structured are linked to that colonial process. And the effects that they're now receiving through major storms, hurricanes, and so on, can also be linked to that process. So we need to think about it. How do we marry these issues and link them up and show what are the effects that are happening today, which are huge and phenomenal. If we think about, for instance, in the Atlantic hurricane season in 2017, many of the Leeward Islands of the Caribbean faced huge effects and huge costs. Puerto Rico, which can be considered a colonial outpost of the United States, had billions of dollars in costs, and Puerto Rico was in blackout for a number of weeks, literally a number of weeks. In 2019 alone, we had a number of deaths, and if we look at the data, a number of the deaths caused by extreme weather events have been concentrated in countries of the global South. If we look at as well in 2019, Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas had huge effects, about over $4 billion in costs alone. That has increased the Bahamas public debt to more than $500 million as a result of, these storms and major weather events. So we kind of have to look at it in a holistic way, and as you've been saying, in a systematic way, in terms of how we marry our history and history of the world and what has happened in terms of capital accumulation, especially in the global north, and the after effects that we are seeing in many of the countries in the global south.
And Keston, I would want to ask you, from the perspective of the countries that may be most disproportionately impacted by climate issues, do you have thoughts around policy interventions that they should be looking at and to address the disproportionate impact, and how they may be thinking about negotiating their arrangements at the UN and at the international infrastructure level? What should they be thinking about doing from a policy standpoint, and what are the constraints that you may see they're having, whether domestically or internationally?
I think we have to, there's a lot of work around, thank you, Margaret, for that question. There's a lot of work around looking at the various aspects of climate responses and climate change policy responses in terms of adaptation, meaning how do you adapt to the current situation into that climate change is happening, and you have to basically, your systems, your governance processes and so on have to adapt to that, as well as looking at mitigation, which means reducing the levels of greenhouse gas emissions and at the United Nations and at the level of the International Panel on Climate Change. They have said we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I think, for about 45% over the next couple years, right? Mm-hmm. How I have focused on this issue is looking at it from the point of view of what are the losses and damage that countries, especially countries in the Global South, already face. Meaning, we're already seeing extreme weather events. We are already seeing a number of significant storms and sea level rise and droughts and so on already happening. And this has caused huge losses in terms of their output, huge losses in terms of livelihoods, huge losses in terms of deaths. And I have been looking at how do we address the issue of the gap of, at an international level, the gap for financing and financial support towards compensating basically these countries for the losses and the damage they are already facing. And at an international level, through the Paris Agreement in 2015, there had been negotiations and discussions around an international financial mechanism for loss and damage. However, due to the opposition of the United States, there was no commitment to actually setting out an international financial mechanism to compensate these countries for the destruction that they're facing. And my approach and what I have been thinking about along with other people is that we need to consider this beyond the issue of aid. We need to consider it beyond the issue of charity, which has been a part of appeals when countries face major natural disasters. They put out appeals for good thinking and right thinking citizens to support them. And I've been thinking about it in terms of climate reparations, which is a program of action around compensating these countries for both what they have been receiving now, the effects that they're receiving now, but also on a long-term program to help them become more resilient. And if we think about it in terms of reparations debate, it's a very different discussion than suggesting investors, which is part of the debate around mitigation and adaptation at an international level. Investors should benefit from the losses that these countries are receiving and should put their money towards helping these countries adapt. That's a very different discussion. Right. And looking at it around compensation specifically.
How far has this work gotten, this work that you are working on with other scholars on climate reparations? Is it just in the halls of academia right now?
So there have been people who, for instance, a scholar at the University of Hawaii has been, I think, on this discussion longer than I have. And she has done critical work in law, actually, which is quite interesting, around making a case for climate and climate reparations and compensation. Her name is evading me right now.
Yes, well, we would like that name. and so we'll get it from you, yeah.
There have been a number of other people who, I think someone mentioned recently to me that international negotiations, especially from a legal framework, has been going on to include loss and damage in treaties and multilateral negotiations. I think it hasn't moved forward to the extent that it should, in part because of global politics and global climate politics, where countries largely have been talking about mitigation issues, that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as opposed to facing the responsibility of paying for the damage that they have actually inflicted due to their sort of corporate and other types of economic activity.
Thanks, Keston. And I mean, the theme of this discussion is rethinking capitalism. And over the last 2.5 days, we're 2.5 days in, we've had many, thinkers who have been sharing their thoughts. Jeremy Lent, Margaret Heffernan, Guy Standing, Professor Ove Jakobsen, and many others. And they're all talking about how we can look at capitalism again. And I wanted to pose the question to you. Do you think capitalism, in the way it is operating in the world right now, needs to be rethought? If so, how? And what are your perspectives on that?
It's a tough. By the way, the scholar is Maxine Burkett. Okay. She is at the University of Hawaii and is a legal scholar. She's also part of a Harvard University panel on reparations, which is looking at a range of issues for which reparations should be a solution. It's a tough one.
But let me, okay, yeah, go ahead, sorry. I just wanted maybe to hone
Capitalism is the animal that we're facing now and that we have to contend with. I think one of the lessons that we have come about as a result of this current coronavirus crisis is that many of the things that we took for granted, for instance, what we're calling essential workers and key workers and people who work in frontline jobs, who are low paid, who are the lowest paid, who have in many of our countries the lowest status. They're more essential in many instances than much of the work that have the high prestige and status. They are the ones who have been carrying the economy, but also facing the most risk, right? In many instances. So people that we used to take for granted at the supermarket, checkout people and people who are working in care work and so on. Many of these people have become so much more important to us and to what we think about who gets what and who deserves what in our society. I think part of the question around rethinking capitalism is, what do we want our society to be? I think that's the major issue. And what do we want our economic system to do in support of people who are least able to manage their circumstances, women and especially who have a lot of care responsibilities, people of color who continue to receive disproportionate pay levels, who have, there's a huge ethnic wealth gap if you think about the United States as well as the United Kingdom. If we think about levels of housing and so on. So our provisioning system has, in all levels, provisioning in terms of housing, provisioning in terms of care work, provisioning in terms of maintaining a habitable planet. These are areas that have come to the fore in terms of where do we consider distribution of resources, but also where do we consider taking care of ourselves and taking care of our planet as a whole.
Right, but you've written quite a bit on, the political economy of fossil fuel reform. Is that an area that you want to share a couple of thoughts on right now?
So my work on fossil fuel reform took me to Haiti. And I guess, I mean, that work came out of my experience that I had in Haiti around a climate policy project. And it is a complicated scenario, in part because many of the international economic institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the G7, and so on, have been pushing, especially since the 2008 crisis, have been pushing countries to reform their fossil fuel policies and subsidies around fossil fuels. This has been, these kinds of policy reforms have been wrought with serious problems, in part because it means withdrawing support for the lowest and most vulnerable, lowest paid and most vulnerable members of society. It means as well, the rhetoric around reducing fossil fuel dependence has been on the issues of climate change and addressing climate change. However, the actual practice of the policy has been actually just liberating energy markets so that multinational corporations can enter those markets and can get new markets and new consumers for their fossil fuel products. So it's actually not changing the system of fossil fuel dependence. It's actually just creating a new dynamic where perhaps multinational corporations, which are no longer seen as good guys in the global north, now have markets in the global south to gain, profits and revenues.
And just a provocative question before I go to bring Shruti into the discussion. I mean, in Guyana, there was this big oil find and all of that. There's been a lot of mobilization around that. What would you say to governments who are cash-strapped that have now found access to these kinds of resources, which in other parts of the world we are stepping back and away from, but these countries now have the opportunity to really gain and build themselves based on the old system, and they're actually going through that right now. What would you say to that phenomenon?
Is it me or Shruti?
You.
Oh,
so I'll go to Shruti after.
So Guyana is caught in a really, really difficult scenario, right? So Trinidad and Tobago can give us, it can show us some experience in terms of what fossil fuels can potentially do. And hydrocarbon resources can do. I think the 1970s and 80s were the best years in terms of how we managed to utilize those resources for developmental purposes. So we have a lot of lesson from that period. The challenge with Guyana is that it has set out on a path that with ExxonMobil, that as the main driver and producer of fossil fuels in that scenario. And what has happened is that geopolitically, Guyana is in a very tenuous circumstance. The last election has shown you the United States is going to intervene, and the other countries, they're going to intervene for their corporation. So the ExxonMobil is a US-based company. And governance-wise, it means that these powers are going to try to ensure that fossil fuel rents go towards their corporations as opposed to the people and the population. It's also caught in another constraint where in the global north, climate activism and the movement towards fossil fuel divestment is going to place a lot of pressure on new producers of fossil fuels, such as Guyana, and is going to, we don't know what is going to happen in terms of market prices for the foreseeable future. For any country that is now producing fossil fuels, it's going to be moderately low. And so we don't know what sort of benefits are going to be down to the people of Guyana. Guyana has a lot of experience in extractive sectors, and it has not, to this point, worked towards the benefit of the population. I don't see that changing, unfortunately, especially with the kinds of forces and actors that are so heavily invested in this kind of project, be it from the United States, ExxonMobil, and other, they're also using Guyana in a politically sensitive way to address the situation in Venezuela, which is another kind of and when I say that, I mean Guyana potentially is going to be a base, some sort of base or some sort of launching point for the United States to launch some sort of intervention in Venezuela. And fossil fuels are going to be the pretext for which that is going to be done. So it is a really, really, really difficult scenario on many fronts. And we just have to wait and see, because we don't know what's going to happen.
Do we have to wait and see? Professor Shruti Pandey, I'd love to bring you into the discussion now on rethinking capitalism. I can't see Shruti though. My screen.
You can't see me?
I see you now. I see you now. So we were discussing earlier on the global city and the movements and the drivers that you identified, capital and technology coming in at city level, and the rights of the people not being recognized. Could you speak a bit on a human rights approach to rethinking capitalism?
Yes, thank you, Margaret. And thank you again for inviting me and including me in this very fascinating conversation, which is helping me think also, because we don't have solutions. We are all in the process of learning and understanding and distilling these ideas. But here is, so my entry point, I'm not an expert, unlike Keston, I'm not an expert on climate justice. I am also not an expert on human rights, but I have been working longer on human rights. And
you had a human rights institute in a law school, and you have significant track record in human rights.
I worked long enough. I have been around for more than a quarter of a century now. It's been a long time, and I have been at it. So my entry point on climate change is actually through urbanization, and my entry point into urbanization is through my human rights lens. And so maybe I can, and I see that all of these have there's a common enemy that they all have to address, which is so either whether I am a human rights person or I'm working on just urbanization or I'm working on climate change issues. I think that they all have to grapple with the monster of capitalism that is staring us in our face. So let me just say a few things, which are both in terms of epistemological as well as methodological from my human rights activist lens. So first of all, and I think most of it is about the endeavor to bring the various pieces together. And I think that is one of the major advantages of using human rights. Just the fact that it helps us think across and also, mediate competing interests and find solutions. I think in terms of just what is it that I'm trying to address in this scenario of urbanization, climate change, in which urbanization is a major actor, which is the kind of human activity. It's one of the largest areas of human activity that is leading to climate change, what they are now calling Anthropocene, an entirely new epoch, geological epoch. First of all, I think that we need to understand that sustainability, resilience, peace and security, and inclusivity are all, they all are tightly intermeshed. So we can't talk of, and I have a colleague who's from Europe, Cosmin Corendia, who has written a lot about what he calls the hybrid approach, where he's talking about the climate change, the refugee crisis, and the human rights issues. He says that they must be done together, and I completely see that point, the point that he has been making repeatedly. He's written a lot about that hybrid approach to climate justice, and I think that so that's one. So and I think that together, if we see the connecting link between them, sustainability, resilience, peace and security, and inclusion, we see that it is about a paradigm of sustainable development. And then connect that with capitalism. What is capitalism doing to our development? All of us now agree that we want sustainable development, but we don't necessarily agree about what is sustainable development, which is why we are still we are still trying to understand, we're still trying to make a case why fossil fuel need to be given up. Because so that sustainable development itself is something that we have not agreed upon, and all of us look at it from our own sustainability. And so that brings me to the second point I'm taking, and you can stop me, Margaret, if I go too long on this, but I have just 3 more points. The second point I want to make is that relating to sustainable development is the fact that sustainable development cannot just be, and this is again for me as a human rights activist, I think it is important understanding to build, that this is not just about human beings. Human rights are no longer, and I think climate justice tells us that it's not just about us humans. We are not the owners of this earth. So we are here along with the non-humans. In fact, non-human animate as well as inanimate. So what we see as inanimate, not in the global south, I think many civilizations don't see soil and mountains and sky as inanimate, but yeah, maybe in the conventional, in the dominant paradigm. So humans and non-humans, animate and inanimate, are all to be included in imagining what is sustainable. And I think sustainability is no longer, we don't have the luxury of imagining sustainability as just for ourselves, because we know that finally then we are also doomed. And then secondly, about the current futures and the current generation and the remote future generation. So not just the next foreseeable generations, but the generations that come 300, 400, 500 years, thousands of years later from us. How do we negotiate our rights and responsibilities with those remote future generations? And lastly, the fact that environment is necessarily a transboundary. So it makes national borders irrelevant. Water and air don't understand national political boundaries. And so this whole, the dominant paradigm in our legal system, which is around sovereignty, where extraterrestrial is an exception, is something that we need to be very mindful of. The fact that that environmental justice cannot be within the national and sovereign function principles. So these 2 points, and then
can I just hear what you just said, that you said environmental justice cannot be within national boundaries, and is that what you, I just wanted, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we don't have the option now of not including the non-humans, not including the inanimate. We don't have the options of not thinking of the remote future generations. And lastly, we don't have the choice of not moving beyond our national boundaries. We can go on believing that, this is my country, and this nationalism on steroids that we are witnessing all over the world, is something that we know it's not going to help us. So we don't need proofs of these. We know it. And, right. And I think another point related with both the first 2 points is the fact that as human rights, so one of the major advantages of using human rights approach is the indivisibility of rights. So the social, economic, cultural rights and the rights, the civil political rights. And so this speaks to the fact that in most of our countries, especially the countries that are now the new emerging world powers, and the countries of global south, I think that we have these authoritarian regimes that are rising all over the globe, which are promising economic social rights of some modicum, but they are not, but they're taking away, from the other hand, they're taking away our civil liberties. And I think that climate justice again tells us that that fragmented approach is never going to allow us to. So this whole, the clamp down on dissent, the clamp down on information, the clamp down on activism, the clamp down on people who are, and I mean, this whole thing about curbing democracy in the name of giving you food, water, shelter, or, and so at the end, we don't have any of those. And lastly, I think the role of lawyers in this. So role of law and lawyers, where we are we have a vested interest as professionals with guarding our territories. We have a vested interest in mystification of law, what Robert Unger calls as mystification of law, or arrogating inordinate power to ourselves, and this whole thing of casting an inhibiting spell, as Unger calls it. The fact that as lawyers, we are encouraged to be apolitical, to be seen as professional, but not really go to the politics that underpin our legal, the laws. And so I think that, and so we are not really addressing the political issues. We are not really allowing ourselves to go to the root causes. And so all we are doing is like tinkering on the superficial. And I was reading last point, Margaret, I was reading a European scholar called Elizabeth Fisher, who's written about what she calls the deliberative consultative model of regulatory approach, where she says that, we can be experimental. We can be, we can go small steps. We may even fail. We may not really get to the success, the big success right away. But it's important that we do it in a deliberative consultative model and not be, I think that those are the approaches I see will work in, because capitalism cannot be dismantled. And this is what Unger calls as the dictatorship of no alternatives, where he says that we have a closed list of capitalism, socialism, feudalism, and we don't think beyond these closed lists. And he says that, we are not looking, we are also looking at these systems as indivisible systems, but we have to find, in today's times, with the kind of challenges we have, I think there is a way to unpack these and then look at what an earlier speaker in today's deliberations was calling the politics of paradise. I thought that was beautiful.
Beautiful.
I thought that was really beautiful. Instead of a false choice between utopia or nothing, I think there is a way to do it incrementally and to really question everything at this moment. The good thing about the huge challenge of our times is that we have to open up everything and unpack it and look at everything very carefully again. So,
and I think bring all these domain experts together to think through these challenges with the lawyers. Now, so if capitalism, as you are saying, does not really address collective interests, right? It keeps us bordered, and we're thinking about our sustainability within borders. And so Guyana just found this oil, and other countries, and they want to exploit it for their own development, but what's happening worldwide in our positions. And if it's not a framework for the protection of the rights of future generations, and if it's not creating a framework for us to recognize non-human rights and ecosystem rights, and we, I think, need to start thinking about, well, how can we rethink capitalism in such a way that we are putting in place and working toward the putting in place of an infrastructure that addresses these issues that you've raised, future generations, non-human rights, our collective agenda, and our collective issues. And so, as a lawyer, thinking through this on my end, I also have come to the view that in terms of what we have so far in the international human rights framework presents a starting point for us to start thinking through how we do this at a multilateral level. And so we have these treaties where over 193 countries of the UN agreed to civil and political rights being recognized, and they passed it into their constitutions, and economic, social, and cultural rights. They agreed to economic, social, and cultural rights. Some countries have started to bring that international law and policy, but most countries are not addressing that framework. And I was hoping, Shruti, that you could speak to that framework that exists and the opportunity that we may have if we were to start organizing around economic, social, and cultural rights framework. For those who may not be lawyers in the room and who may not know about the frameworks that we have there.
So, this, and the lawyers in the room would know that economic, social, cultural right. There are two international treaties that were the earliest international treaties on in 1966. One which was called the ICESCR, which is the International Convention for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the other one alongside, which was the International Convention for Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR. Now, that was a major, it was a major flaw in the vision, in the envisioning of these rights as not one together, but as, two sets of rights. And for a long time, till the 80s, we continued to treat them as two separate boxes. And so it was possible to negotiate, give you one and withhold the other. So civil political rights could be held back. Your right to question, your right to ask for information could be held back, or right of expression could be held back on the promise of giving you. And that's a recipe for authoritarian regimes. But we also know that finally those authoritarian regimes don't even give the minimum, guarantee of food, water, economic, social rights, food, water, sanitation. And so we walk into, so we know that slowly as human rights field advanced in the last decades of the last century, and we know that we tried to bring that to end that bifurcation and fragmentation and to bring them together. And I think that, but I think the challenge remains. So in our minds, we have understood this, but in terms of methodology, we have still not understood how to do it. Right. Because it is true that economic social rights require investment of resources. They're not, they are what was earlier called the positive rights. Because they are positive rights because they require things to be done. They require budgets to be allocated. They require, and so they can, and as against civil political rights, which are mostly exercising restraint, which were wrongly called negative rights. But I think the challenge remains about so slow and progressive realization was what was promised in the Economic, Social, Cultural Rights Convention. But what is slow and progressive? How do you measure that? And then there are, and so I think economics, so we know that we are country after country, including mine, are electing what people call strong governments, but what I see as authoritarian governments, if not dictatorships, if not fascist governments. These are because we because what was the point I was making? Yeah, because we think that they will be strong in their policies, and we are happy to surrender our other rights. But I think that continues to be a challenge for us to keep on bringing back to the table that these are all indivisible rights. They cannot be torn apart.
Right. And would you say, I would say that, we don't have enough interrogation of government policies within the construct of the progressive realization of economic, social, and cultural rights. The discussion hardly comes up, right? And so, but when it does, governments then say, well, you know, there are budgetary constraints, but it hardly comes up. It's hardly advanced as a critique of government budgetary policies. I mean, policies are critiqued in many ways, but using that framework and citizens understanding that they actually is an avenue for them to seek recourse through the international framework for the failure to recognize economic, social, and cultural rights. You know, it's just an area where I'm thinking, and from what we've been reading and from the experts and activists like yourself that we've been talking to, that we are thinking, Shruti, of organizing a community of practice to start thinking about supporting the advocacy of these economic, social, and cultural rights, and as a framework to interrogate political decision making. So, because this is the issue, right, guys? What frameworks already exist, right, that we can tap into to begin our organizing, and what new frameworks can we begin to design that we can lobby and progress from the bottom up. And yeah, maybe I can bring you back in, Keston. Any thoughts on what we were saying? And if you all have any questions for this panel, please feel free to write it and I will pull it in for you. Well, let me go straight. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I don't know. It's tough. I mean, there is a lot of, obviously, based on what Shruti has mentioned, and I'm sure many of the discussions you're having, there is a lot of work around thinking about, new and heterodox, what we call in economics heterodox frameworks that have existed for a long time. Many of those much of that work has been marginalized, right? From either in the academic sphere or either in public discussions and through the popular media, in part because of what the world we're living in under a system of neoliberalism, right? And we're seeing some of those discussions already happening in the United States, for instance, in the UK, even though sort of progressive voices and figures have not actually won elections in those spheres. But the problem, a part of the problem in those progressive frameworks, at least those that I've seen come out in recent times, both in the United States, and I'm using that as a reference point in part because of the hegemony of the United States and the influence it has on the global economy and system, is that they totally disregard any sort of ideas from the global South and groups and movements that have been working on these things or facing these problems for decades and centuries, right? Part of what has been marginalized as well as indigenous thinking, indigenous movements, indigenous peoples who have been addressing issues. They didn't call it climate justice, but they call it living in harmony with nature, socio-natural ways of living, their ways of planting, their ways of doing and existing, considered nature as the core nature as the core of their survival and their way of thinking, their way of teaching their children, their way of passing on that knowledge. you know, much of that we need to excavate and re-excavate and get back into. And it in part, we have to draw upon movements in our own environments, whether, you know, historically or whether they exist today, and not be too drawn and enamored by, you know, some of these ideas that come from the West, because we do have solutions that exist in our own environments. People who are experiencing deprivation, who, you know, many of us, some of us might think, and this is the narrative, that, you know, these people don't know what they're experiencing, or they don't have solutions to their own problems, but they often do. And they enact those solutions at a small scale, at an individual level within their own families and communities. They're just ignored and marginalized because we don't think it doesn't come from expertise, or it doesn't come from, you know, these kind of technical and prestigious sounding kinds of things. But we do have solutions, we do have frameworks. We need to draw upon them, draw upon the history of it to really, you know, kind of recapture the essence of where we're at and where we need to go.
Yeah, love that, love that. And Keston, I'm looking at the time and I'm going to start, you know, winding down. I want you to, in terms of the focus of your research and work going forward, what is the area that you are focusing on advancing, and if you were thinking through at a policy level as well, policies that you're working on, can you share a little bit on that with us?
I mean, my work has sort of moved in part because of the experience I had living and working in Haiti for a short time. And it has moved more towards advocating sort of these kinds of heterodox ideas around reparations, around climate justice, around climate policies, whereby countries that we, you know, Haiti is a country is not often talked about or discussed at an international level, but, you know, historically has been the first Black republic in the entire world, has been a country where there's a huge amount of history and a huge amount of resources in terms of livelihoods to think about that. You know, I can't even imagine how Haitians have survived centuries of the kinds of marginalization and subjugation they've faced. So that's how I think my work has been going in towards issues around climate justice, climate policy, issues around critiquing, I don't call it critiquing capitalism in to some degree, and trying to find just frameworks to ensure that we survive. And people who are at the forefront of the, you know, climate disasters receive their just due. And yeah.
Just frameworks to ensure that we survive. Just frameworks to ensure that we survive. And Shruti, we were talking earlier about the global city. And I see the implications of what you were sharing there being driven by the capitalist system that we are operating in. So I wonder for this group that is here, you can bring back in that, that particular issue that is happening all over the world right now, and that drive for the global city.
Right. So the global city, as I'd explained, is, you know, becoming more and more a commodified kind of a space. It's become, in fact, one of the urban sociologists, Saskia Sassen, has said that it is a commodity. It's a commodity of organization of the global capital. So it is. It's actually a very stark face of the kind of capitalism we are witnessing, the unbridled capitalism and the shrinking away of the state. And as Keston has very, very rightly pointed out, and thank you for bringing that on the table, you know, I think it should be very central from this panel discussion, that, you know, the global South, the kind of developmentalism that we have been, you know, we've grown to feel very apologetic about, you know, and including our cities, but also other, you know, aspects of our economic lives and our social lives, which we've been told as, you know, being backward, and that the North will come and tell us how to do it right. I think that global North-South divide persists and through the market now. So I think that is a very, very important part. And also the fact that the capitalism today is you know, has convinced us that it is only us as individuals. So it has atomized us, you know, in a very, very in a way that we no longer think of ourselves as communities. We have just lost the habit of thinking of ourselves as communities and as community, you know, rights. Because as Keston rightly pointed out, I think communities have, and even in the global North, the indigenous communities have known how to live. They may not have used the language of rights, but they have known. And so I think that the way forward, which the kind of the crises, multiple crises in urbanization is pointing to, or the climate justice is pointing to, and right now the pandemic, they all are pointing us to one single, you know, drastic change in the way our lives have been organized around capitalism, where the state has absolutely no core and minimum obligations. Even the core and minimum obligations have been taken away. We are not expecting the state to do that. The state's role has become more and more a negative role as far as the communities are concerned. The state is completely taken over by the corporate interests, and then the global North-led corporates, because of the kind of, you know, the ability of the technology to move capital. So it's a new kind of imperialism that we are witnessing, because with the inordinate power of capital and shrinking away of the state. So I think that indigenous communities, or just community rights, which is why, I mean, earlier we had, when I began my work, I remember they used to say that civil political rights are the first generation rights, the economic social rights are the second generation rights, and the community rights are the third generation rights. And then we dismantled that. But I think that what we lost is the fact that there was supposed to be community rights in the human rights framework. It wasn't supposed to be atomizing us. But right now, human rights also have adapted to the power of capital by atomizing us, by giving us individual rights. And that, I think, is the tyranny of the civil political rights being seen as the visible face of rights, as against the economic, social rights and community rights.
Guys, I want to throw this out to both of you, because this panel discussion has kind of emerged as a really global South sort of perspective on rethinking capitalism and looking at, we don't have a lot of these spaces. And so it could come across as, you know, one voice, one thing being said here, and that's fine. But I'm wondering, how do we bridge gaps here? How do we bridge the gap between the global North agenda and the global South agenda, even though they may not have one directing mind, but the global North interests and global South interests. And even that sounds like we're creating a monolith of the global North and a monolith of the global South. I certainly don't want to do that, but there's certainly some shared problems and concerns at both these levels. And I want to ask, what can we do? What can bring us all together? What are the bridge building things we can find? You're on mute.
I think my take is slightly historical because we are connected. We have always been connected through processes of colonialism and capitalism, right? The who wins and who loses has been an effect of that kind of interaction. we're seeing, for instance, this pandemic has shown the kind of economic wherewithal. The global $12 trillion has just been appeared and have been dispersed through these economies, whereas many countries are putting themselves in debt. I mean, you know, we're talking about countries in Africa, we're talking about countries in the Caribbean. They don't even have proper means for addressing health services, for providing health services, providing educational materials and so on. So we have been always connected. Communities in the global north also are at the peripheries of their societies as well, right? We were talking about African Americans in the United States, indigenous communities in the United States, women in women of color and so on. So connecting, and this is what I wanted to highlight in my talk, is connecting those levels of injustices that are happening to communities both in the global north and in the global south, and understanding our historical connections and the history of why the problems we have today have arisen, can provide us some root and some around that. I'm trying to remember her name. Roy mentioned that we're now looking through a vortex, and we can think about it. How do we go through that vortex and try to bring together and bridge those kinds of divides by understanding our shared history, but also shared injustices that you know kind of transcend geographies, really.
I love that.
Yes, Arundhati Roy. Sorry, yes, Arundhati Roy have a very interesting way of looking at the pandemic as a vortex and a way of looking through the other side. Whatever comes through, however we come through that other side is really dependent on our organizing.
Right.
Shruti?
Yeah, I would take that forward and say that, so globalization was supposed to be globalizing us. It was supposed to, bring our global north-south together. And we thought we were doing that, but we had a sense that it was not happening in a completely even manner. And globalization was working positively for some and negatively for some. I think that now the juncture that we are at, I think that it's an opportunity to finish the unfinished to complete the unfinished agenda of globalization. So I think,
complete the unfinished.
So completely unfinished agenda of globalization, the globalization that remained incomplete and selective. And I think that, it is ironic, but it is a powerful irony of our times that we are forced to now do that. The unifying forces are the forces of crises. And so the crisis of climate change is one such crisis that forces us to think beyond our regions, our nations, our regions, our north and south. The crisis of the pandemic, and this is not the only pandemic. We all know that we are entering into what has been called the era of pandemics, and so this is going to be happening more and more because of the way we have encroached out of our territories, human territories, into the wildlife and the areas not meant for us. So the crisis of climate change and refugee crisis, the crisis of pandemic, and the crisis of capitalism. I think the capitalism itself is in a deep crisis, which is why capitalists themselves are reflecting. They are themselves, open today to changing their practices. And I think that these, the fact that sadly, ironically, but firmly, we are being pushed because of these crises to unite, to overlook our north-south, that, and in the meantime, in any case, the hegemons are changing. You know, the hegemonies are changing. We know that world powers will not be the same world powers. So I think it's a moment of opportunity. It is a moment of opportunity. And that gives me a lot of hope with all the despair that we are facing today.
Okay, all right. So I actually am really inspired by both the discussions I've had with both of you today, because climate reparations and just frameworks for our environmental survival is something that we are going to plot. So Keston, I don't know if you know, but one of the things we're doing over the 5 days is having conversations with domain experts like yourself and pulling out from you interventions, system intervention points that we want to map, and then come back to you, you know, in terms of support and stuff going forward. So that's really exciting to me. And also with you, Shruti, the human rights framework and approach, and using that and developing that going forward. I'm not seeing any questions from the room. Is this, does anyone have any questions you'd like to write in the chat to this panel?
Either we were totally non-convincing or totally convincing.
What a quiet room.
We made perfect sense.
What a quiet room. That is interesting.
I'm really satisfied with the discussion. Therefore, I am enjoying the discussion. That is the real and time issue. That is, I have no such question, but I am enjoying the discussions overall.
Okay, so questions are coming in. Yay, but Mohammed, where are you coming in from?
I'm from Pakistan. I'm from Pakistan. We have so many such issues like political and climate change and or other social issues, what we have realized in the pandemic. And therefore, I am continuously understanding this topic, which I am recording with me. I hope I have a discussion group in Islamabad. For me, these are the focused issues and the challenges we have in Pakistan and especially South Asia.
Okay, cool. And I see Libby. Libby has asked a question, which is, it's what I'm asking all the time as well. How can we work together to continue this transformation of the economy worldwide? That's the big question of this summit. How can we work together? We are all working in our silos, in our own ways, to try to create this change. Either one of you could jump in again to answer, Libby.
I think we've started our conversation, right? I am open to learning from other people. I want to learn from other people and understand their perspectives and where they're coming from and their own experiences as well. I think having these kinds of conversations as human beings can be an opening, can be a way to open up possibilities of organizing new kinds of activities, events, interventions, organizing, that kind of those transnational connections that we really need to have to I guess, to subvert what's going on, the kind of supranationalism that we're seeing at the moment.
That's right.
We need to develop those connections more and more and learn from each other. So yeah, definitely.
And Kareem, I see you have a question. Do you want to ask it or do I read it out?
I can do that. I don't have my webcam attached right now, so you're going to have to do it with audio. But I think one of the major issues that I come across in my work is that to make a just and fair transition possible. So especially where I'm from in the Netherlands, and I think we see that in Western Europe a lot, climate issues have been an issue of the more privileged, whereas the people around the streets are typically white, higher educated, higher income, and I'm really concerned about how do we make this a social and just transition, and how do we make this something of that propels probably progress for people that are less privileged than the average maybe in our country, but maybe in India we still have to bring a majority of the population into the same kind of middle class privilege that others enjoy. So I'm just, how do we, I think the question is really about how do we shift our focus to making it a just and fair transition, and if you have any ideas of that around that, or mechanisms that you see work, etc.
Can I?
Shruti, for sure.
Yeah. And this was a point I anyway wanted to make. So thank you for bringing that up, Karim, and also Lipsa. Your question, I think to both of these, I would say that what we need to constantly remind ourselves is, while we look at the transnational and the global connections and work across regions and across disciplines, I think that we have to constantly remind ourselves that we have to listen to the communities on the ground. We have to start from the local. So the local remains very, 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 very central and very, very important and very emergent. And as Lipsa, you very rightly said, the fact that the informal labor, the kind of struggles, their struggles are of everyday survival. And how do you lift up, but they are the ones who are facing the brunt of capitalism the most. And we saw during the pandemic in India, we saw people, the informal workers fleeing the cities because the city offered them nothing. So I think that the local remains the point at the mobilization of the local remains very, very precious while we make the connections at the global level. And I think not to lose either of them is very, very important. And of course, looking beyond our disciplinary boundaries and our comfort spaces, being open to new imaginations, being open to, leaving our the settled positions that we thought we were very sure of. But I think the local is, and this, Margaret, is exactly what you have been talking about, the community of practices, the community of network community of practice. I think that the community, which is the change, has to come from bottom up. And so this whole revolt against elitism is a very valid revolt. It's happening. It's also being misused to to form governments, the populist governments, in the name of moving away from elitism. But I think that that there is a way to keep our eyes and ears glued to the communities on the ground without running into populism and without running into authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, and I feel like it's those of us in the middle here, this hybrid space where we are still, connected to at the ground level what's happening, but yet, and we have to be honest, we have a privilege of space in our heads in terms of, our profession or where we're at. And so I think it's those of us who are in this hybrid space, not necessarily political power, not necessarily huge business interests that we want to protect and that will always be, coming into our focus. Those of us in this area, this is why what we're trying to do with Future Law is bring a sort of a network at a multilateral level in this middle thing, that holding these who are on the ground, who don't have the time and space. They're focused on survival, right? And so, those of us who are not focused on survival and can still keep our eyes on the ground, how can we come together and start creating new connections and new coalitions for action? And I see Lipsa has asked or is it Libby? Libby asked a question, said this: there are many statements of value, manifestos of the emerging coalition forming collaboratives, Is anyone creating a synthesis of what we're all dreaming of for politics of paradise? Is it the same as the UN framework of rights, or is something new emerging? And I want to just take a stab at that and then throw it to the panelists as well. I want to say, well, are we taking a synthesis of what is going on? We are seeking to do so, and that's why we are really trying to have these collaborative journeys where we are telling you, please write in the chat. And for every session, we're encouraging you to write in the chat, because we are saving these chats and pulling it out after. So that's one. And two, is it the same as the UN framework of rights, or is something new emerging? I would say, and my personal position and the developing position of the Future Law Institute is that it has to be both. I know there are those who feel we must just go ahead and build something new and make the old system obsolete. And I'm all for that too. But I still think that there is work that can be done within the existing framework. And so I don't see it as an either or. I see it as there's an existing framework which is not being maxed out, which we're not doing all that we can to pull the juice out of it. And so we want to do that work while also building something new forms of collaboration. And I don't know if either of the panelists want to respond to Libby's question there as well. Sure. Yes, Shruti.
Very quickly. So something that has occurred to me because of the kind of changes that we have been witnessing in India around the funding of civil society organizations, and because we are part of that, which you said, that we have a unique position. We as civil society actors, we mediate the two sides. We are not political parties. We are not into electoral politics, but yet we are engaging with politics and bridging the communities with the powers to be. But I think that there is a big politics around the funding of this work, and in India, you know, the funding is being legally shrunk. Because funding holds a lot of power, and the certain kind of funding is being allowed, funding for, you know, service kind of work, you know, setting up hospitals and schools, but not funding for advocacy and rights, funding that would raise issues. And so, and I think that we have to ourselves step out of our comfort zone, because at least in all my career, you know, I'm from the generation which was the funded civil society generation. Before me, you know, there were people who, the civil society activists were seen as people who lived the Gandhian, you know, the people who had very little, lived with very little. And then the professional NGOs, the professional civil society activists. And then, you know, we said, why shouldn't we also earn well? Not as, you know, not luxuriously well, but well enough. And I think there was a point to it, but I think now we are back. I think we will have to, and what you're doing, Margaret, is exactly that. This is, you did not wait for funding. You will have to, you will find funding from here on maybe. But I think at this point, it is important to just flag the fact that where you get funding from, what kind of funding for what kind of activities is going to also decide what kind of work you do.
Yeah, it's difficult because
and your credibility and your legitimacy, you know, because in India, any work which is foreign funded is not considered legitimate work today, because they say that this is some foreign conspiracy, you know, and in this hyper nationalism kind of environment, foreign funded work does not have legitimacy. So working with the communities is not easy. It is very hard. It's extremely hard. It's not hard just for those communities, but us also, because the resources become that much smaller. We have to also stretch our comfort spaces. You know, with very little resources to work is very hard. It's not easy. And then, so it's going to be, you know, in my work with the city, the urban slum dwellers, as they are called, they say that we know you belong to us only if you face the police brutality when the demolition squads come, you know, when you stand with us and face their bullets, when you face the violence with us. Because don't tell us that you have come to work with us unless you stand with us during a demolition drive. And I think there is a point there, you know, we do it at our convenience. We don't really inconvenience ourselves, you know, and I think we need to also be very self-critical in this. And the government also, in India, the government has been saying, who are you? You are 5-star activists. So they say that you guys hold your meetings in 5-star hotels, and you stay in 5-star hotels, you travel by air, and you talk about working for communities. So that completely discredits all our work. And so I think, you know, we need to make lifestyle choices for ourselves in this scenario. So I think this introspection and this transformation that we are imagining has to begin from ourselves. And I think that's my final, I mean, that's something that I remind myself again and again these days, you know, that any transformation I'm imagining right now, I have to first practice it.